Hi everybody, Charles here, and let me start by apologizing in advance for any light fluctuations. I'm relying on the light coming in through the window, and it's a cloudy, occasionally sunny day, and who knows what's going to happen when I'm in the midst of recording, so we'll have to live with that. So why am I making this video? Well, I want to follow up on a point that I wanted to cover in the loaded image video, and it was a little too off topic and I didn't want to run on and on. So I thought I'd make this separate video about connotation, a very literary issue. And so let me start with a non-cinematic literary question. The difference between the sentence, "he walks down the street," versus "he saunters down the street." Why do I start with that? Well, because both of those sentences say exactly the same thing in terms of strict utility of message. That's to say, communicating what is happening. A man is walking down the street. A man is sauntering down the street, on the other hand, is slightly different in connotation because the word is both a less frequent and because it's more associated with sauntering than is with just simply walking. By choosing the word saunter, you are effectively raising the level of rhetoric, if you will, of the sentence. Now, that's an awful lot to start with. And what does it have to do with movies? Well, we'll get into that now. Now, there's a difference between connotation in language and in the photographic or cinematic or videographic image. And that's because language is inherently symbolic. There's no direct relationship between a word and the thing, as opposed to in the photograph where there is an indexical relationship between the image and the thing that has been photographed. By indexical, I mean that they're one and the same, that the apple will always be an apple, and that there was an apple at that moment to be photographed. That has some advantages. It makes the image much more concrete. It obviously takes in much more than can possibly be written. But the disadvantage is that because of that concrete nature, that apple will always be an apple first. It can't be made into something else without the help of connotation. Now, what I want to talk about is how connotation in film and video is manipulated and how it's used, because it is only through connotation that metaphorical relationships can be created. Since we're dealing with a fairly literary question, the whole notion of connotation, I'm going to focus largely on narrative film in video in this. And I would argue that there are two sides to connotation, what I would call internal versus external connotation. Internal can embrace those background details that we talked about in the loaded image, but I want to focus on explicit details that are emphasized by the story. So, for example, let's say we have a young man who falls in love with a woman, and the first time they meet, he gives her a rose. Then the story shows them in various activities in which the woman continues to be associated with roses until the moment where she tells him she wants to break up and leaves him. At that moment, he takes the rose and he crushes it in his hand. Now, it's not as if he suddenly has some animus against roses. It's rather that he's built an association between the rose and her, which we understand. The important thing to recognize here in terms of connotation and metaphor is that it's not as if a rose has suddenly become something else. It is something else only in the story's terms because the character has come to associate roses with the woman. The point being that we have to know what a rose is in order to be able to understand that change in his thinking. And so that's external connotation, and I'm going to get into that in relation to broader questions about detail and how storytelling is done. As I suggested, in order to understand the internal connotation of the rose in our example, you have to know the external. You have to know what a rose is before you see it. Now, that obviously makes it very easy to identify within the story's parameters, but and this is important, there's always going to be more associated with that rose than is required by the story. And that's what leads to the possibility of external connotation. But before we get there, I want to talk real quickly about how objects and spaces are used in a kind of utilitarian way. They're kind of the visual equivalent of walk in the sentence I started with. The idea that just what's necessary to function. And to get there, I want to start with a humble object, a pen. We'll start with the humble ballpoint pen, which is likely to be used in a purely utilitarian narrative service to the extent that it acquires any significance at all. And it is significant only to the extent that the story and characters assign any particular function to it, and then only within limited actions. And so it almost literally is an embodiment of any pen will do. And next we have the executive pen, which is more assertive as an object, is obviously more expensive than a ballpoint, it's more visually refined, and it's just as restricted in action terms as the ballpoint, but it has a stickiness with associations beyond purely utilitarian use. It announces wealth and sophistication, for example. It can be used indiscriminately, but it's more likely to be used under more special circumstances. Who knows, you might even get a close-up. Now, moving on to our third example, we have something slightly different. The quill is still a pen in the sense of an object used for writing, but otherwise it's too anomalous and striking not to call attention to itself. It has to be explained, except in a period setting, in which case if it isn't there and they need to use a pen, that in itself becomes anomalous. In other words, the associations come from outside, both in terms of what we know or think we know, our previous experience of other movies, of life in general, that a business executive is unlikely to use a quill pen. If he does, and it's not explained by the story, then it takes on a presence that is basically impossible to overlook. Whereas if it is then internalized by saying, oh yes, this exec likes quill pens, then however odd it may look, people will accept it as being just part of the overall atmosphere. Now, you might be thinking all of this is obvious, but that's sort of the point, really. It's the kind of thing that we know and yet don't acknowledge, which is why it's very powerful. Because there are certain expectations that have to be addressed, and if they aren't addressed, call attention to the manufacture that you're watching. Filmmakers will do everything they can to control what people see and the qualities of what they see. And at the same time, however, even though this presents lots of problems, it's also very powerful, as my idea of the executive who uses a quill pen suggests. It introduces the possibility of meaning that isn't necessarily inherent in action and characters, but which is there as potential in the background, in the objects that the film is showing, in the world that it's revealing, even if it's revealing it in a way that no one ever intended. One other point that I want to make is that because these external associations are social, they're outside the control of any one filmmaker or film. And thus, every image has the potential to call attention to things that nobody noticed before. The most obvious example of this are anachronisms or changes in fashion. But even leaving those out of it, every image, the realistic image, is based on the idea of persuading the viewer that what they're seeing is really happening, that it's in the real world. But because the real world changes, so too will those associations. And thus, that's the origin of datedness. It's a matter not just of changes of convention, but literally changes in the world. And thus, the loaded image.